Good morning, sisters and brothers. It's an honor for me to be back again at this pulpit. Thank you, pastors, for the kind words of this morning. I again want to reaffirm Hesston College's relationship with Hesston Mennonite Church. We were birthed out of the same thread, and we've lived together these many years, and I look forward to another wonderful year. I realize this coming year is going to be different for you and for us. Living in the midst of COVID-19 has changed many things, and the sharing of facilities includes that, how we use facilities, how we share them. And I want to, ahead of time, ask for your forgiveness, because I know we're going to slip up this year and make mistakes as we learn what it means to be Hesston College in light of COVID. And so I ask for grace, I ask for mercy as we live into this year together, and our commitment to walk with you as church. As we look at our reality today, I see a lot of empty pews in the sanctuary. And yet, Hesston Mennonite Church really has not changed, has it? Because it's not about this building. That's not Hesston Mennonite Church. And Hesston College is not about the buildings either. And I mentioned that on Friday night. I've said that to our faculty and staff on a consistent basis as well. It's the people. And so Hesston Mennonite Church continues to be Hesston Mennonite Church in spite of COVID, even though we're not gathered in this place this morning. So this morning I'd like to share with you our theme verse. Our theme verse this year comes from Exodus chapter 16, verses 4 through 6, and you heard it read a little while ago. But before I jump into Exodus and our message for this morning, I want to speak some to the framework from which this passage comes for us. And for me, this passage starts with Jesus. And it's understanding Jesus. And if you're to turn to your Bible this morning to the Gospel of John, chapter 6, you hear Jesus talking about He is the manna, the bread of life. And in many ways, when we read the Bible, we start with Jesus, right? As Christians, we're not followers of Moses. We're not the followers of Abraham, Isaac, Isaac, any one of them. We are the followers of Christ. Christians. So we start with Jesus, we start with the Gospels, we start with the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus references back to this passage and talks about this manna, but he says, no, I am the bread of life. And he goes on to talk about that, and we need to keep that in mind as we reflect on this Exodus passage. The other piece I'd like to do is maybe give a brief introduction to Exodus, so that you have an understanding where I'm coming from when I speak about this passage. And as I've read from Waldemar Jansen, who wrote the commentary on the Genesis, he speaks to this notion of some key themes that run across Exodus, and it's this. Exodus is not so much about the Israelites exiting from Egypt, but it's about trust and obedience. And there's this theme of trust and obedience that you see interwoven into Exodus at different points. Now, interestingly, right, if you go and read in the Gospels the Sermon on the Mount, what is that calling us towards? What is Jesus calling us towards when you read about that, right? The teachings of Jesus in the Gospel, it comes back again to this notion of trust and obedience. And you see this theme coming out over and over again. So that's one piece. The second piece of Exodus that Waldemar calls us towards is this idea that God is commissioning God's people, not so much to be this chosen people unto Him, but to be this holy nation for the whole world, right? It's a holy nation for the whole world. It's not this kind of select people for God's pleasure. It's not this idea that there's this exclusivity there. No. It's this idea of God's mission into the chosen people for the whole world. Number 3, the set of laws that are talked about in Exodus isn't so much to be understood as a noose around the neck of those Israelites. The laws are talking about how do we understand this relationship under a new master, new directives under a new master who is God's self, right? Not Pharaoh, not the rulers of the land, but God. And what do these laws do to speak to that relationship of being under a new master? And finally, 4th is that on grace. That God's grace to be understood as God presence and never abandoning God's people. In the midst of things, in all of this, though, there is this orientation of totally pointing toward God. And so there's a two-way play here that works with grace, right? Within this context. On the one hand, God always being there with the people and never abandoning the people. And on the other hand, it's the orientation of the people toward God. It's a two-way piece here that again works around this theme of trust and obedience. So with that in mind, let's jump into this passage some to talk about trust and obedience. And as we do that, I want to share a little story. And this is a story about my daughter, Faith. And, there's a lot of things about Faith that, that still puts a big smile on her daddy's goofy face. But I still remember when Faith she was probably about 2 years old at this time, and we went to the swimming pool to swim. And at that stage, Faith didn't know how to swim, but she was just dying to get into the water. So we had these big old, what do you call it, the arm air things that you put on them so that floaties so that they don't sink. Never quite trusted them, but nonetheless, and the thing I remember about Faith was she would stand on the side of the swimming pool and she'd say, Daddy, catch me, Daddy, catch me. And she'd jump into the water and I'd catch her, right? And she'd just be giggling and laughing and wrap her tiny little arms around my neck as hard as she could, laughing and giggling all the time. But this is what I remember telling Faith. I said, Faith, dear, I love it when you jump to me in the water, but please, before you jump in, you look at me and say, Daddy, I'm about to jump in so I can expect you, right? Because if I don't know you're jumping in and I start to swim away and you jump in, you could get into trouble. And Faith, obedient. Every single time she'd say, Daddy, I'm going to jump in now. I said, yeah, come on, jump in. I'll catch you. I'll take care of you. You can trust me. You can trust me, my dear daughter, my beloved daughter. And you see, this is the piece that God is getting at, right? Between the trust and the obedience. They go hand in hand. And as we look at this passage about the manna, right? Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, talks about this manna and God providing manna for one day. That's it. One day at a time. One day at a time. With one exception, and we'll get to that, but it's only for one day. And as you continue to read in chapter 16, you find those that went out who did not get enough manna that morning, had enough manna. Right, Ken? Enoughness. There was enough. Even if you took too little, there was enough. If you took too much, there was enough. Now, those who took too much, the manna they hung on to, well, it started to smell and maggots came. Pretty gross, I think. But nonetheless, that speaks to greed. Not only does that speak to greed, right? That speaks to the non-trusting. The non-trusting in God. When God says, one day, that's it, one day. Will you trust me for this one day that I will provide enough? Don't worry about tomorrow. because I will take care of you tomorrow as well. But my call for you is to trust me today, that even if you don't take enough, you will have enough. Even if you fail to take enough, you will have enough. Because imagine going out and collecting manna is a physical labor. What happens to those people who maybe don't have the physical ability to collect enough? Will they starve? No. Because God took care of them even if they didn't have enough. But for those who didn't trust God, or those who were hoarding to take away from others, what happened to them? Maggots and rotting food. Maggots and rotting food. Trust and obedience, sisters and brothers. Verse 5, keep the Sabbath holy. Keep the Sabbath holy. And this was the one exception, right, that God gave. Collect for one day, except for the day before Sabbath. On that day, I will provide enough, right? Enough again for 2 days. So collect, double your portion. Enough for today, enough for tomorrow. Why? To keep the Sabbath holy. Sisters and brothers, when we look at our lives here, and I'll confess, I am bigly guilty of this. When I think about my life these last 6 months in trying to prepare our college, I did not do very well keeping the Sabbath holy. I'll confess that. And I wonder how many of us on a regular basis fail to keep the Sabbath holy. Holy meaning that this is a day of rest, right? 2 parts to it. Number 1, a day of rest based on God's creation story. God worked for 6 days to create, and then God rested. And this rhythm of life that's into everything that God created, is part of our lives too, part of God's life. And the holiness of that, to rest, to set aside, is the second part. To rest and to set aside for what? To focus on God. This is the one day where we break from work, where we break from our routine, and we trust God to provide for that day. On that non-Sabbath day, God will provide enough for us so that on that Sabbath we are cared for, we're taken care of, so we can rest and focus on God. And yet, how many of us are maybe addicted to those things that we believe needs attention 7 days a week, that we're not willing to trust God to rest and focus on God? Sisters and brothers, God is a selfish God. God's a selfish God. God wants our attention. God wants to be in a relationship with us. And God has built Sabbath into all creation. Even the land is called for a time of Sabbath. Even the animals, the plants need a time of Sabbath. But see, the other theme within this, right, is in this time that they're in the desert, and otherwise, there were the slaves. On Sabbath, this was a day for the slaves also. In the land of Pharaoh, they had to work 7 days a week. They were slaves. There was no rest. But God said on Sabbath, the slaves are to rest. The slaves are not to work. So I wonder how many of us are shackled as slaves today? And what does that slavery look like for us today? As we look at Black Lives Matter and the impact that has had for us, this movement had on us, on our consciousness as a country over the last few months, and continues to have for us, slavery is a theme that's behind that, but yet I wonder how many of us still live within that, not realizing that. If only we would listen to God's call for Sabbath, which breaks that chain and says, slavery is not only wrong, but Sabbath is for all. What are we locked into as slaves, sisters and brothers? And finally, in verse 6, God's manna is God's manna. God's manna is not some sort of human bread. God's manna isn't something that Moses and Aaron spent all night cooking so that the next morning the people had food. God's manna 100% came from God, right? Just like Jesus, right? The bread of life. Jesus was not our creation. This was something that God created for us. Manna can only come from God. It can't come from anyone else, from no human being. And it's an expression of God's love to say, trust me. I will take care of you from my own self. Be obedient and trust me. The manna is something that is unique to God and God only. And that's a piece that we must always keep in mind in front of us. That manna is life. And it's life that only God can give in our time in the desert. So how do we work at this issue of trust and obedience? And sisters and brothers, I realize that what I'm about to say may not be easy for some of you in where you find yourselves in your life. The issue of trust, many of us have lived through broken trust where we've been hurt. And so I want to be careful about what I'm about to say, because for some of you, this may not be easy for you to hear. And you need to know that this is something that you need to walk into carefully. And it's not easy. It's not easy. And for some of you, it will be hard. But I would argue at the root of a lot of the issues that we're dealing with is that factor of fear. If you look at the children of Israel in the desert, fear is something that they were encapsulated by. Where is their water going to come from? Where is their food going to come from? And you know, it's interesting as you start to read this book of Exodus, right? You start to see the Israelites start to long for those days under Pharaoh and say, boy, didn't we have it good back there. You know, at least we had food, at least we had water, and they're starting to complain. They weren't groaning anymore, right? God, when they were slaves, God was listening to the groans. Now, they're moaning and complaining, right? Moaning and complaining out of fear. But sisters and brothers, fear is what haunts the world in which we live today. Fear is what causes broken relationship. Fear is what moves us away from right relationship with God and right relationship with our neighbor. This fear, when it captures our heart, has a way of enslaving us. Maybe it's fear that I don't have enough money, so I have to work 7 days a week. And for some, that's a real reality. Don't get me wrong, sisters and brothers. There are many in this world that live in real slavery and have to work 7 days a week just to put food on their table. But you know what? That's a sign of a broken system in which we live, the broken world in which we live. When we look at systemic issues of poverty, of racism, of sexism, Pastor Clayton prayed about that a little while ago. And these are real realities that exist in our world today, sisters and brothers. And we might be living here in Hesston, Kansas today, void of that, focused on our own selves and our own fears around COVID. And how do we protect me and my family? But yet, it's out there, sisters and brothers. Slavery is out there. Fear is out there. Racism is out there. Sexism is out there. Homophobia is out there. All those issues of fear are out there, sisters and brothers. And God is calling us away from that, saying, trust me. Be obedient to me. Jesus, God in person, incarnate here in this world, the teaching speaks to that. of relinquishing our fears to trust and to obey. So the movement away from fear starts with thankfulness. Starts with thankfulness. But thankfulness is something that starts in our heart and in our mind. It's a mindset of being thankful. Are we thankful to God for what God has provided? Are we thankful to our neighbors, to our faculty members, to our RAs, to others, to our pastors? Are we thankful? Do we have a mindset of thankfulness? Because that mindset of thankfulness leads us to gratitude. Gratitude is thankfulness in action. Gratitude is not something that rests in our head. Gratitude is a verb. It takes on action. But it has to start with thankfulness. You don't just have gratitude on its own, but it has to start with thankfulness, which moves us into acts of gratitude. We treat others differently out of actions of gratitude. It's not actions of self-indulgence. I'm not nice to someone because it makes me good. I'm nice to someone because I'm thankful to God. Thankfulness that leads to gratitude. And this gratitude, sisters and brothers, can lead us towards true trust and true obedience with God and with our neighbors. And you know what? At the moment that we can move towards trusting and obedience, fear starts to melt. Fear starts to get mitigated. And we're able to understand ourselves living in community with folks much bigger than in our own little world of our own self-indulgences, of our own self-fears. Sisters and brothers, this is my challenge for us in this coming year. Sisters and brothers, change your mindset to a mindset of thankfulness. Take that step. And I know for some of us that's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because of the lives that we've lived, the way that maybe we've been treated. And it's hard for us to see that. But I ask you, I challenge you, start with baby steps. Start with small steps for the small things that we see around us that we can be thankful for. Because when we can see the small things, we're able to see things are slightly bigger. And with that, something even larger too. And as we start to have this mindset of thankfulness, it can allow us to put that into action, into actions of gratitude. Actions of gratitude that can have ripple effects in the community in which we're living, sisters and brothers. Because with this COVID right now, we're needing to learn what it means to be community in a different way. And we need this. So in closing, sisters and brothers, I ask this of you. As we work at mitigating fear through thankfulness, gratitude, trust, and obedience, I ask for that, for the notion of kindness. Be kind to yourself and be kind to one another. May God's peace, love, mercy, and grace sit with each one of you in this coming day, weeks, months, and year. Go in God's peace, sisters and brothers.